Welcome back, everyone, to part 2 of my retrospective on the 6th console generation. And this time, music wise, I chose Tekken Tag Tournament soundtrack. So, with that said, first up, the PlayStation 2. And part 2 of the retrospective, easily, arguably, the best selling of course, the 6th console generation by a landslide. In part 1, we looked at the Dreamcast, which unfortunately sold around 9 million units total worldwide, and this sold 155 million units. So, needless to say, it sold very well compared to anything else that sold more than the Dreamcast, Xbox, and GameCube combined, even twice over, and still outsold that. That's a definite landslide, but needless to say, I always did find interesting the Model 1 PS2. I mean, first of all, the fact that you could adjust the PlayStation symbol that way depending on how you want to stand it. Up sideways, though I always preferred laying it down. But of course, your two control ports, your memory card slots, and then on the back, with the old model, you would plug in here basically a hard drive, which would allow you to then use the console for network. Strangely enough, there's no normal plug-in slot for using dial-up internet or anything. Instead, you had to use this expansion pack. Then you would plug in a special unit multiple thing in that slot. Of course, regular power, and then, strangely enough, with the PS2, you have this power switch on the back of the console, and you would actually have to turn it on before you could actually press the normal power button. That was one thing I always found kind of bizarre about the PS2, about that power switch on the back, which is very unusual in my opinion, though it was probably designed for safety in mind. But the PlayStation 2, of course, released in fall of 2000, early millennia, though it would, of course, be released already by the end of 1999 in Japan, obviously. Since usually consoles launch about a year earlier in Japan. Not so much nowadays, which is interesting how that has changed for the most part. The PlayStation 2 was definitely revolutionary, but graphically, it wasn't much different than the Dreamcast. Definitely the Dreamcast, though, was a better designed early console for internet service and online gaming. The PS2, however, even though it had functionality for internet, it was not great for the most part when it came down to it in that domain. From the 6th console generation, you want internet stuff, you would go with either the Sega Dreamcast or, of course, in my opinion, spiritual successor, the original Xbox, which will be in part 4 of the retrospective. Now, also I want to mention quickly different specific PS2 games that hold a special place for me, whether it be in what period, time period wise, in the era of the PlayStation 2. Now, a game that comes to mind because it was the very first game I actually ever played on the PS2, it would be the first game I ever bought as well. Now, of course, this is just greatest hits version because I lost my original one long ago for moving around multiple times. But yes, my very first PS2 game I ever would play was Tekken Tag Tournament, and to this day remains pretty much my favorite Tekken game of the franchise as a whole. And obviously, the music is superb. That's one of the things I love about Tekken Tag Tournament is the soundtrack, and I actually went out of my way to get a physical copy of the CD. Only a slim amount of video games ever do I go out of the way to get a soundtrack to. But Tekken Tag Tournament is one of those that love the music, and for being a launch title, graphically speaking, this was actually really good, price-wise. I also want to quickly touch on one of the things I found most interesting about the PS2 was the fact you had a slot holder here for PlayStation 2 memory card, which I always found interesting. Interesting enough, though, the GameCube would also do this with their cases as well, having a slot for a memory card. I guess basically, so you could put it in there if you wanted to take it over to a friend's house, play a game, and you didn't want to have to start from the beginning from scratch. Just bring your memory card, that way you can start wherever you left off. One of the things I miss is the memory card era. Unlike some people out there which love their hard drives and stuff, yeah, but hard drives are also prone to having, of course, eventually failure or having a corrupted hard drive. Though it's been known to happen to memory cards too, having stuff become corrupted. But for the most part, I've never really had any issues with memory cards being corrupt. But definitely an incredible, great way to start off, I think, fighting game wise, hands down, with the PlayStation 2. Though there would be another game I would also pick up just a couple months later, which was, in my opinion, the criminally underrated Street Fighter EX3. Personally, I love this game, and yet this was also a launch title. It was nice, it was a couple of really solid launch title fighting games. I am glad about that. So, within the first year of having the PS2, I had Tekken Tag Tournament and Street Fighter EX3. Not a bad way. And unlike some people out there, of course, I love the gameplay aspects of this game. Always have, always will. Unlike some people, I genuinely enjoy this game like I've said before. The fact of the matter is, it is a great fun game, gameplay-wise. It plays very well. I like the way they implemented like the tag mechanics and the special different fighting game mechanics in the game. It has a lot more complexity to it than most other Street Fighter games, with the exception of maybe the Street Fighter 3 series. Next is talk a little mention about of other fighting games from the PS2 era that I personally really enjoyed was the very first Dragon Ball game I would ever purchase and play, which is why it holds special nostalgia factor for me, that being the original, of course, Dragon Ball Z Budokai. Budokai is a great game, solid. Yes, some controls might be clunky nowadays, and there's definitely way better DBZ games like argue Budokai 3 is probably about the best overall gameplay-wise, in my opinion, but that's if you don't mind 3D brawlers and stuff like 3D style arena fighting games. That's one of the things I actually like about Budokai, is that it's more 3D gameplay rather than 2.5D like, of course, fighters. But I love this game, and I love the fact, yeah, there wasn't a huge amount to the game. It was predominantly tournament mode, versus mode, and then you had story mode, which was very loyal to the first, like, 3 seasons, into 4th season of Dragon Ball Z, of course, predominantly revolving around, like, the Saiyans coming to Earth, also the fact, of course, Frieza, everything Namek, and ends with Cell. But it is a great game, story-wise, great, and I love the fact that they made it feel very much so like the actual TV series. And it was interesting, they did it in sort of an episodic style format for it, which I find very interesting, and I always will have a special place for Budokai. Now, a game I want to just briefly mention, in my opinion, very criminally underrated from the PS2 era. this was the first true, like, overall 3D arena style fighter for a more traditional fighting game, and I get why some people don't like this game. It is definitely considered to be one of the black sheep of the family, but I love it regardless. And that is, of course, Tekken 4. In my opinion, criminally underrated. It deserves a lot more love than it gets. Unfortunately, looking back, a lot of people like to bash on it just because of how unique and different the gameplay was versus other games in the franchise. But regardless of what some people's opinions may be, I love Tekken 4, always will. I just think the gameplay overall is interesting, and the stage designs and stuff are very interesting. Like, I love a lot of the music in the game, like fighting in Shinjuku, um, fighting in the parking garage was always one of my favorite stages actually in Tekken. And the fact that it would be the first one to experiment with be able to knock people up against wall and do a little additional damage. This was the game, the prototype, for a lot of stuff we would see in Tekken moving forward. Yet, for some reason people overlook this game. Also, Heihachi was a great boss battle in this game. Also have other games quickly touch briefly on, and that is one of my personal favorites from an art style standpoint, Final Fantasy XII. Final Fantasy XII will always be probably one of my top 10 favorite Final Fantasy games of all time, arguably. Um, I liked this game more than probably a lot of people did when it first came out. It was treated in the beginning as a black sheep of the family, much like Final Fantasy Type 0. But as time has gone on, I think more and more people have come to appreciate Final Fantasy XII for its unique style of gameplay and for many other elements that it would incorporate, making it feel a little bit more of like a online type MMO game, I guess you could say, gameplay wise, and the fact everything was in real time rather than random battle encounters. The fact you could avoid fighting creatures, I actually liked that. It made it refreshing, very unique and different. And in fact, also in this game, one of the main villains is the character with the name Cid, of course, which Cid name has been around in the Final Fantasy series now for quite a long time. But I love the art style in 12. It's very unique compared to any other Final Fantasy game. Arguably, it has probably the most distinctive art style of any mainline Final Fantasy game. At least in my opinion. Also, when you talk about PS2, you usually talk about a lot of times fighting games or RPGs. But I argue also it's a great console for horror fans as well. With games, of course, such as Resident Evil 4, which is arguably many people's opinions the best Resident Evil game of all time. Now, personally, I will argue that, at least personal perspective, 2 is my favorite, then probably, well, and then probably the other one would be Resident Evil Code Veronica X, though, and it plays great, though I still prefer playing the Dreamcast version of that game. Still, Resident Evil 4 is superb, and it would heavily influence, obviously, the moving forward gameplay aspect, because this would be the first one that was not a traditional survival horror, with more action gameplay-wise, and not the clunky controls, though that was one of the things I always enjoyed about the early era Resident Evil was the clunky controls, because that's what, in my opinion, separated the classic, true survival horror game from modern horror games. This was very much more action-oriented, rather than being a more traditional horror game. Also, I hated the escort missions, though. But when it came down to it, of other horror games, I don't think anybody can really deny the greatness of the Fatal Frame series, but specifically Fatal Frame 2 Crimson Butterfly is arguably, in my opinion, the best of the Fatal Frame trilogy that was released in the 6th console generation. I like the story best. I love, of course, the art style. I love the creepiness of the ghosts. And I just find the game fascinating. In my opinion, Fatal Frame is far, I think, creepier than most other survival horror games just because of the fact you can't actually see the ghosts at normal time. You can only see a spirit through using the actual camera. And that's what made this specific game very unique and different from any other horror franchise of all time. Because of the camera mechanic, it gave Fatal Frame its own distinctive flair and style, art-wise. And of course, it has a great art design, like character designs. But then again, Team Ninja was involved in the creation of the Fatal Frame series. So I'm not really surprised given you had the involvement of Tecmo and Team Ninja. But regardless, this game is great if you like good, creepy games. And if you ever get a chance, check this series out, especially before it gets too expensive, because it's starting to go up, and I recommend trying to get hold of these games. If you want specifically, though, try at least one game, I say Fatal Frame 2 Crimson Butterfly is the best overall experience. Now, if you want the creepiness, the creepiest game in the series, I would say probably the first game is the creepiest in my opinion. But take that with what you will. Everything is subject to opinion. Also mention briefly of others, we would see technically 4, but I forgot to get this out before the video. We would total end up with actually like 5 total Silent Hill games on the PlayStation 2, which is why I love it so much. The fact you have, in my opinion, one of the greatest horror series of all time was Silent Hill. My number 2 favorite horror series of all time. Yeah, you had, Silent Hill 2, which is arguably considered one of the greatest games of all time by most people and critics alike. Then you have the interesting direct sequel to the first Silent Hill, and the only time this actually happened in the franchise, having an actual sequel. Silent Hill 3, which is actually my best friend's favorite of the franchise. Now, for me personally, in my opinion, the most criminally underrated game in the series is Silent Hill 4 The Room. I get it why a lot of people don't like Silent Hill 4 The Room, but personally, I will never understand why people dislike it, because in my opinion, Silent Hill 4 The Room is such a great game, very unique compared to any other game in the franchise, with everything starting out in that small room. And the story is very interesting, and there's a lot of complexity to a lot of Easter eggs and things throughout the game that I really appreciate. Of course, we would also see Silent Hill Origins be released on the PS2, which I am happy to say at least I have 4 of the 5 Silent Hill games on the PS2. Though then you have Silent Hill 4 or Silent Hill Shattered Memories, which is going to set you back over $200. Needless to say, a very overpriced game. But in my opinion, if there's any, like, say, 2 specific games in the series I recommend to play, I recommend Silent Hill 2 and Silent Hill 4 The Room. Now, if you don't have a PS2 and you have an Xbox, you can get either of these 2 games also on the original Xbox, and a little cheaper on the Xbox as well. So, keep that in mind, but I do highly recommend playing the Silent Hill series. This was, in my opinion, the golden age of Silent Hill. A few more before I finish up this little bit of retrospective. I want to briefly touch on some other games that, in my opinion, very dark, messed up, but really fun regardless. And that being, for, of course, Twisted Metal Black, which is probably my second favorite of the Twisted Metal series. Though Twisted Metal 2 always hold my favorite spot. But Twisted Metal Black is by far the darkest, most grim, and by far the most messed up of the series. Obviously, Sweet Tooth plays a key role in the game, but then again, Sweet Tooth is basically the face of the franchise, in my opinion. There's no better character to define Twisted Metal than Sweet Tooth. But this is a great series, or a game. You can get this, of course, remastered on the PS4. I recommend doing it. The game is a lot of fun. It has a very good, decent difficulty. It can be quite hard, but it also has a great multiplayer mode for, of course, between 4 friends with split screen. I know that sounds weird to people nowadays, but it wasn't back in the day, and this was arguably, probably, overall quality-wise, probably the peak of the franchise. I wish more people would give Twisted Metal a chance. Especially Black is a great one. Also, quickly touch up on, of course, a series I was introduced to on the PS2, and arguably today my favorite series. And of course, that being the Kingdom Hearts series. Though there was also Rechain of Memories, I don't care too much for that game just because I don't like the card mechanics. But arguably, this would be one of the first RPGs I would actually buy for it. I remember getting Kingdom Hearts 1 back in, I believe it was 2003, I originally picked the game up. So I've had Kingdom Hearts 1 for 18 years. That really makes me feel old. Obviously, this came out right before the merger because it still had the Squaresoft logo at that time. And of course, in most people's opinions, the best of the Kingdom Hearts series, which would be released in the mid-2000s. Now, personally, I would pick this game up around 2000, I believe it was around 2006 when I originally picked up Kingdom Hearts 2. But I will never forget it. These are definitely two PS2 games that hold a very special place for me, given how much I love the Kingdom Hearts series. But really, PS2 was a great console for many genres. If you love sports, you had the Gran Turismo games, as well as Need for Speed games, and many other, of course, the Madden series, and many other great sports games. As well as, of course, you even had rhythm games like Guitar Hero and Rock Band. And the last couple, briefly mention, is, of course, the Soulcalibur series. Was arguably the most successful of the bunch. Soulcalibur 2, with, of course, Heihachi Mishima is the guest, and then Soulcalibur 3, which personally is my second favorite of the Soul series, outside of Soulcalibur 1, of course, for the Dreamcast. In my opinion, 3 was the pinnacle when it came to gameplay and the amounts of single-player content. This easily had the most overall content of any game in the franchise. If you prefer playing fine games by yourself, well, this is probably the best fine game I can think of. And the fact also, character creation mode would be introduced first in this game as well. And the last two games, quickly touch on briefly, games that do hold a special place I've had for a long time. The first of the Drakengard, or however you want to say the name from, of course, Square Enix. Though there are now like 3 games in the series, the last game in the series was released at the end of the PS3 lifespan. This game is really interesting and very unique. The fact that you joined up with a dragon, which could speak to you telepathically, you could combine your life force together, which is kind of similar to that of actually, well, some of the story elements kind of remind me of the movie Dragonheart, interestingly enough. As well as there are elements in it that remind me also of the games like Panzer Dragoon. But Drakengard is a great game, and I highly recommend. It's a great third-person action game, which you can fight on ground in normal hack and slash, or jump on the dragon and attack from the skies, which is a lot of fun. Honestly, the gameplay aspect and the mindless destruction is my favorite part about the game. But some of the gameplay definitely reminds me of definitely Dynasty Warriors from a lot of different gameplay perspectives. Last but not least, quickly touch on is from Kojima and Konami, the original Zone of the Enders. This is arguably one of my favorite PS2 games, and it was a great series. This and Second Runner, though I still prefer the first game more. I actually like the full CG cutscenes, though it hasn't aged as well as the, of course, anime cutscenes in Second Runner. Plus, Second Runner's got even a PS4 release for VR compatible, which is very unique. But for me, Zone of the Enders is a game that will always hold a special place. Arguably, gameplay-wise, it is solid, great. You can beat the game in like 10 hours, no problem, or less, but I like taking my time and just enjoying it, enjoying and listening to the beautiful music, because that is where games like this stand out. It just saddens me to think that at one time the great quality stuff you had from Konami to what Konami has become. But with that said, this is just a little bit of a retrospective and discussion on, of course, the PlayStation 2. And with that said, I hope you enjoyed this. Leave a comment below. Tell me, when was it you first played a PS2 if you did? And if so, what are some of your personal favorite franchises or games? Heck, what was your favorite genre of gaming from the PlayStation 2? I look forward to seeing feedback, and I look forward to seeing people's opinions on the 6th console generation. With that said, stay tuned next week for part 3, which will be on the Nintendo GameCube. And I'll see y'all next time. Same YouTube channel. Stay safe.